Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us today, and welcome to the press conference. I'm joined in this press conference by Nomsa Machesi, who is the DA's Shadow Minister of Basic Education, and Professor Belinda Bozzoli, who is the Democratic Alliance's Shadow Minister of Higher Education, but who also heads up the work stream on education, both higher and lower, within the Shadow Cabinet. We will obviously read through a statement, then both Nomsa and Belinda will make short statements, and they will be happy to take any of the questions that you may have. Let me be very, very clear that the Democratic Alliance strongly opposes the decision by President Ramaphosa to close the nation's public schools for 4 weeks. And we can announce this morning that we will be approaching the courts on the basis that it has been a political rather than a scientifically motivated decision, and it is certainly not a decision that has been made in the best interests of South Africa's 14 million school-going children. The decision to close the schools across the nation for 4 weeks is irrational as well, based on all the available evidence, which is that schools do not pose a higher risk to learners and staff than many other places. Indeed, even in her press statement yesterday, the Minister of Basic Education, Angie Motshekga, reacting to the President's announcement, said, and I quote, "It is important to bear in mind that the latest opinions of the Ministerial Advisory Committee, medical and science experts, is that learners are better at school than in communities and homes where the infections are actually taking place," unquote. Since the beginning of the crisis, the government has refused to release the MAX advisories to public scrutiny, precisely because government's decisions are not based on the science, as they tell us so many times, and as this particular decision proves. Instead, it is made on a political basis and responding to whoever is able to shout the loudest, whoever brings the most political pressure to bear on the president. Just this morning, Professor Shabir Mahdi, who serves on the MAC, confirmed that government has not taken the advice that schools should not be closed. He said, and I quote, "I think it is a case of government deciding to take advice from the unions rather than from the scientists, because the scientific community has been pretty uniform that there's very little reason to close schools. The opening of the schools has got very little to do with the transmission of the virus, and if anything, the closure of the schools is going to do more harm than good," unquote. Another MAC member, Professor Glenda Gray, confirmed that the decision contradicted the advice that was given to government and in fact went against the scientific evidence by saying, and I quote, "We believe that it was the best thing for children to be at school because we do not believe that COVID-19 infection poses a risk to their health," unquote. The decision to close schools taken yesterday is a decision as a result of ANC capitulating to the all-powerful teacher unions, SADTU, in particular SADTU, who do not have the best interests of the learners at heart. In bowing to the threatening interest group, what has now been put in peril is the future of young people in South Africa. It has also become very, very clear that the ANC is trampling on the children's basic right recognized in Section 29 of the Constitution to basic education, and which recognizes that education is fundamentally important to the child's health, to the child's security, and it is very, very clear that this decision made is going to have profound impact on the future of South Africa and particularly of young school-going children. What we are not going to do is allow children to become another political football in the ANC's game to entrench their power and access to state resources in the face of dwindling popular support due to their failure to deliver a capable state and their inability to govern effectively. Not only the MAC advisors, but also the South African Pediatric Association and the American Association of Pediatricians have come out in strong support of schools being open. The latter cites mounting evidence that the transmission of the coronavirus by young children is uncommon, partly because they are less likely to contract it in the first place. Governing body associations, NGOs, as well as medical specialists have argued to keep schools open. But these arguments have now been swept aside on a wave of political expediency. In the Western Cape, where the DA is in government, there is indeed no evidence of mass spreading of the virus at schools. Indeed, not a single learner death has been reported to the Western Cape Education Department, and the COVID mortality among the province's teachers is at 0.07%, and it is not any higher than for any other essential workers who have been working during this time. Over half the Western Cape schools have not reported even a single positive case, and of those that have, the majority, at 72.4%, have only reported 1 or 2 cases at their school. It must also be remembered that a case reported by a school does not necessarily mean that the individual child or the teacher was in fact infected at the school. In fact, organizations monitoring Western Cape schools have commented that the learners practice better physical distancing and hygiene measures at school than they do in fact outside school in a surrounding community where they are unsupervised and where parents are at work. Our position remains that those parents who choose to keep their children out of school should be allowed to do so. Staff members who choose to stay at home must accept that there will be salary implications for them. If this were the case, it is doubtful that unions would be calling so loudly for schools to close. The costs of actually closing schools are significant and they are profound and will be borne by children and families for many, many years to come. Many children will drop out of school, never to return, and many, many more will fall so far behind that they will never, ever be able to catch up. Inequality in our society will increase, and poor families who are not able to provide at-home learning will ensure that many of those children will simply never be able to catch up with others. Schools are going to be vandalized, and as education is compromised, so poverty is going to go up. And let us all be absolutely clear, poverty is the biggest killer in South Africa. The decision to close schools underscores the ANC's indifference to the fate of South Africa's children. It comes not even a week, not even 1 week, after the Pretoria High Court found that the Basic Education Minister and 8 ANC provincial education heads had breached their constitutional duty by freezing the school feeding scheme. School closures are going to have a serious impact on the nutrition of vulnerable children, 2.5 million of whom experienced hunger even before the lockdown. Even if the school feeding program continues in line with the court order, many learners will not be able to get to school to collect food, especially in rural communities. What doesn't make sense is that after 4 weeks of school closures, the virus is still going to be there, and infections will still be rising in some provinces. What happens then? Do we simply then meekly succumb to further extensions, even as government is failing to build on its testing and treatment capacity? In a province like the Western Cape, infections are falling. So the government's specious reasoning that schools should be closed because infections are rising does not apply to that province in any case. Yet government has made no exception for the over 1 million learners there. It is very clear that the ANC have targeted the nation's schools for closure, even as taxis are allowed to operate at full capacity and gatherings of up to 50 adults are allowed for funerals, religious services, and for gambling and other activities. So instead of an education and a bright future, the ANC is bequeathing the young children of South Africa debt, hunger, and ignorance. And we will be approaching the court. We've already had one session this morning with our legal team. There will be several others over the next few hours and the next day to be able to understand what the best pathway forward is to challenge this irrational, unreasonable decision that has not been made in the best interest of the youth of South Africa and in the future of the country. What is also disturbing is the fact that we now sit with a lacuna on our hands where no regulations have been published, no gazettes have been published, nobody knows exactly how this is going to work. Nobody understands why grade 7 and 12 learners are now miraculously less susceptible to coronavirus than anybody else. And this stands in stark contrast to the president's announcement last week to ban liquor, where the Gazette was ready within half an hour to 45 minutes after the president spoke. Today, we sit here with confused teachers, confused parents, many of whom now, those who are still lucky to have jobs, have now got to make choices about who is going to and how they're going to provide for childminding facilities for their children while they try and eke out a living in an economy that is depressing ever more by the day. I'm now going to hand over to Nomsa Marchesi, and then after that to Belinda Bozzoli to add from the perspectives from their side, and then we'll open up to any questions that you may have. Over to you, Nomsa.
Thank you, John, and good afternoon to everyone. Just to add on what John has just, alluded now to say that, we are not supporting the decision that has been taken yesterday that says that schools have to close. One has to remember that there are many learners that currently that actually are not in the schooling system, who are roaming the streets and who have no understanding or also, the knowledge of the impact of this virus. So the school environment gives the structure. It gives the education, particularly on the virus, because over the last month or so, when learners were back at school, they have been exposed to the protocols of how to handle the virus, how to protect themselves, how to abide by the hygiene protocols. And also, in addition to that, is the fact that many provinces, actually all the provinces, have said they are ready to accept all learners, as long as it is done using the rotation system. So the rationale behind now the decision to say that schools have to be closed, it just doesn't make sense. If provinces have come up to say, we have a way to allow the schools. As a Democratic Alliance, we've been very clear on the issue of saying, if a school is not ready, it shouldn't open. And we've also emphasized that all the protocols have to be followed, that learners must be able to sanitize, the masks have to be provided, social distances must also be there in order to make sure that we don't compromise on the regulations. And now to come up and say that the school have to be closed, there is nothing that is backing that decision. We still don't know why the minister or even the president has decided to close that. So clearly, it is the unions that are pushing this. And also, if the minister decided to open the schools and now saying that we cannot open schools, what has happened that is actually different? What has made it different? And especially if we have said that, the virus is going to be with us even for more than for a year or two, what has changed? I just have to add on to what John has said, is saying that the virus is going to be with us. We have to learn to live with the virus. And the only way is actually with learners is to bring that kind of structure so that they have a better understanding of the virus and how they can actually protect them. And also to add on the nutrition part, 9 million learners, they depend on the nutrition. And we cannot take this lightly because from what Nick Pauls has actually mentioned in his research is that 1 out of 7 learners now, they are actually they are experiencing starvation. So by now closing schools, that means like not only we're widening the inequality gap, we're actually going to put more learners at risk in terms of ensuring that they're providing with that nutrition. So continuation of school is not only to bring a structure, but also to be able to deal with the issues that John has mentioned and also I've mentioned. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, John. I just want to focus on some statistics that have come out of recent research. The first is that it seems, according to Professor Mahdi, that the amount of infection in teachers and learners is exactly the same as that in the wider community, suggesting that there is no increase in infections as a result of schools opening. And he concludes that, in fact, most infections are acquired in the community rather than the school, because the schools are more protective of the individual than the community is. So that's one very interesting statistic. The other one is that there have only been 10 deaths of children from the COVID virus since the start of the pandemic, which is in March. There have been no increased numbers of deaths since schools went back at the beginning of June. And all of the deaths of children, 10 of them, which is very small compared to the 5,000 general deaths, and some have even suggested 17,000 is the real number. 10 deaths of children, all of whom had very severe comorbidities. This is said by Dr. Glenda Gray, who is herself a pediatrician and who is comfortable with children going back to school and does not believe it. Going to school provides is a greater threat to the health of the child or the teacher than remaining in the community. I believe we need a public education campaign around these kinds of statistics. A lot of what has driven the teacher unions has been fear and ignorance. And it is a shame that the government has not seen their way to providing a proper education in the nature of the virus, the degree of infectiousness of the virus, and the fact that the virus is going to be here for months, if not years to come, and that we need to live with it. And this is another area in which they should have taken their scientists' advice and turned it into public education rather than hiding it. Thank you.
Thank you, Belinda. We're now going to open up for any questions that you may have. Thanks. Go ahead, Roy.
Thanks. You said that this hasn't been a scientific decision, that it's rather been a political decision, and constantly there have been allusions to advantage for the ANC as a party from this. Would you just clarify exactly how the ANC as a party benefits from this decision?
Well, they benefit by keeping the tripartite alliance together and intact at a time when there's clearly been a big division between the minister, who herself was opposed to schools being closed, and the teacher unions, who had a completely different view. And this has been an ongoing battle within the tripartite alliance, and this is just the latest manifestation of it. So this decision appeases the teacher unions, who are a very powerful voice and very powerful lobby around the cabinet table and in government, and it locks out the millions of young school-going children who don't have a vote or a voice around that same table.
I guess it's simply appeasing the unions. It boils down to that.
Absolutely. I see we've got Nkosi Kona. Do you want to go ahead?
Hi, Mr. Steenhuisen. It's Nkosi Kona Duma from Radio 702. I hope you can hear me. Just two questions, really. So when will you formally go to courts? Can you give an indication out of that? And secondly, the unions have actually said that the time of the break will actually be used to go back to the drawing board. They say that the reintegration or the gradual resumption of schooling has been chaotic, and maybe there is going to be time where everyone comes back with best ideas. Why do you think that at least the week or the 4 weeks will not be sufficient to achieve that?
Sure, I'll let Belinda and Nomsa answer the second one. I'll answer the first one. Obviously, it's very difficult to fire off a legal challenge in the absence of the actual regulations or gazette. And so we're eagerly refreshing our government printing works page to see what the regulations are and under what law government is making this particular decision, given the fact that there is concurrent legislative competence between provinces and national government. We are very interested to see under what sections they are exercising this particular power. Belinda, do you want to, and Nomsa, do you want to just deal with the issue around preparedness, etc.?
Okay, I'll come in. With regards to partners, we know that the ANC has had years to be able to have the kind of infrastructure to at least allow learners to use e-learning, which a lot of countries have opted for it. But over the years, we have seen no interest or even a move to really ensure that the e-learning can actually be an alternative. And now to come up for the unions to only come up now and say that can we look at alternatives? We had plenty of time. The schools were closed towards the end of March. We had a holiday then. Learners were on holiday at that particular time. I think the unions could have been responsible enough to say, how do we actually open schools? If they really had the interest of teaching and learning, they should have come up with ideas then. And we cannot now be taking more time from the calendar to try to come up with ways of doing this, whereas we had plenty of time to do that. I think it's unfair to the learners, and not only is unfair to the learners now to keep them at home for another 4 weeks whilst you're trying to figure out what ways can you bring to the table, because we mentioned the issue of nutrition. We mentioned the fact that learners, they need to have some kind of education of how do they deal with the virus, not only in the school environment, also on the outside the school environment. So for them to be outside of the school environment, it makes them even more vulnerable to the virus, because they have no knowledge of how to deal with it, or even the resources, and to be able to to know that they have to wash their hands, wear masks all the time, because we've seen that there are many people that are not wearing masks. So the school enforces that and makes them even to understand that it is important to actually to do that, to protect them. Thank you, John.
Belinda, do you have anything to add on that? Or are you happy for us to take the next question?
Next question is fine.
We'll go over to you, Genevieve Quintal.
Hi, John. Thanks so much. I've covered on some things. Just on terms of the time frame of going to court, we know court processes don't happen very quickly. If you decide to lodge an application next week, what happens if it takes 3 weeks for this court action to happen? You've already lost the 3 weeks of the schools being closed, or the 4 weeks. How are you going to ensure that this happens quicker and that the schools open sooner?
Yeah. Well, obviously, I think that the Western Cape government are consulting their lawyers as we speak, and I think they'll be making an announcement later today or first thing tomorrow morning. And I think there'll be some interesting developments there. But certainly, if we go to court, we will approach on an urgent basis. But I think it is also important to remember that, as is said in the press statement, and as Belinda and particularly NOMSA have so eloquently said, the virus is not going to be gone in 4 weeks' time. It's going to be there. And our concern is that what's going to end up happening is that you're going to end up with schools just being closed again and again and again, and those time frames extended out further and further, because community transmissions are not going to go down. In fact, in many provinces, they're going to go up. And what you end up then is starting to significantly infringe on Section 29 of the Constitution, which is a right to basic education. And we need to make sure that that however it takes and whatever way we're able to do it, that we do get this decision overturned, and that schools open as quickly as possible and as safely as possible, and in a way that will allow them to conduct themselves throughout the time that the coronavirus is going to be with us in South Africa. Vuyo Mvoko?
Yes, can you hear me? Okay. First on the decision to wait for the regulations. Is that on the basis of what your lawyers have advised? Was one would have thought that what the president's pronouncements last night would be sufficient. And then secondly, just what your view, Mr. Steenhuisen, is on what the WHO has said, that you can't really open schools when you haven't contained the virus in communities. And given that we are, I mean, yet to see the worst of this period, I mean, is it not irresponsible to go against what the WHO is saying? Thanks.
Thanks very much, Vuyo. Of course, that the advice from the lawyers is to look at what the president actually tables. As we've seen in the past, what the president says and then what actually happens are often two completely different things. We've seen that over both tobacco and alcohol. So we would like to see the Gazette and we'd like to see the regulations, and particularly to see the pathway in terms of the legislation that the president has chosen. Let's be clear about the WHO, and let's be very also clear what they've said right from the beginning, that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to the coronavirus, and every country has to take into account its own unique circumstances. And South Africa is a unique country. The WHO also has not always been consistent in terms of what it advises. You may recall at the beginning of the crisis, the WHO advised that there was no efficacy from the use of masks in stopping the transmission. They had to do an about turn on that, a U-turn on that, and now masks are regarded as one of the most effective means to stopping the transmission in public places. And so they don't always get it right. But then to say as well, that if that is the case, then why is there not a differentiated approach? The Western Cape, certainly, and the community transmissions have been massively down over the course of the last week, and it appears, thankfully, that the peak has hit and gone from the Western Cape in that particular case. So why are the Western Cape schools now being treated with exactly the same way in which schools in other provinces are, if you are relying on the science and the basis of a community transmission to make the decision about whether schools close or not? There are some other provinces where community transmissions are not an issue as well, and certainly nowhere near the numbers that you've seen in the Western Cape, the devastation you're seeing in the Eastern Cape, and the big numbers in Gauteng. Why are they also being forced, and the learners in those provinces being forced into a situation where they're hamstrung by other provinces' inabilities and failures to be able to prepare themselves adequately for the peak that everybody knew was coming? And that is the other thing that needs to be borne in mind. This rise that we're seeing in numbers is not something that's come out from behind a curtain. Part of the reason that you go into a hard lockdown at the beginning of the crisis is precisely to prepare for this time. We've had one of the longest lockdowns in the world, and if you have not been able to adequately prepare in that time, it's doubtful whether you actually ever will be able to prepare. I'll hand over now to Nomsa and Belinda if they want to add anything to that.
Can I add something on the WHO? You know, looking at their website and at their consistent written advice, not a talk given by one of their members, their consistent written advice on the opening of schools, they say a risk-adjusted approach is what is needed, which is what John meant by there's no one size fits all. You have to look at the risks and the benefits in each different society. And in our society, the risks to poor kids who are not going to school are absolutely huge. Educationists all over the country are telling us, don't keep them out of school. You are really damaging them. So I think you need to look at the WHO as a body filled with different advisors and different pieces of advice. And I would take their website with its official advice as gospel. I mean, not gospel, as what they really think.
Okay, just to come in and add on this, yeah, when John is saying that, like, you know, why don't we look at, you know, the Western Cape who has already gone through the peak? But yet the president is saying that, you know, the grade 12 and the grade 7 can still go back to school throughout the country. And at the same time, they are saying that public school learners can go back to school. What does that mean? Does it mean that, you know, those learners are immune to the virus? So that's what actually is being more the rationality of the whole idea. Because if they were looking and saying, like, you know, okay, let's move and see how the virus is performing from different provinces, then they will say, okay, fine, let's let the Western Cape go ahead, let those provinces that are not highly affected, that might be getting the wave a little bit later, to continue with the schooling there, and close that one that are about to, to face the peak, then it will actually make a lot of, scientific evidence and also, a motivation from that angle. But at the moment, it isn't. It just doesn't make any sense, and that's why we believe that the unions are the ones that are behind this.
Great, thanks very much, Nomsa and Belinda. I don't see any other questions. Is that a, oh, sorry, in Kosikona, once take two, go for it.
Hi, thank you for giving me this chance again. I'm just asking, given recent developments where government has been taken to court, and in some cases, government is actually, the courts have actually ruled in its favor, and hypothetically speaking, in case this court bid that you are now going to make doesn't go in your favor, will you be using the next 4 weeks to somehow offer any constructive suggestions to government, and you base that on what you have observed since government started reintegrating pupils back into schools from June? Thank you.
Thanks, Nkosi Kona, and that we've done precisely that right from the very beginning. There's been a number of submissions made by the DA on basic education, about particularly how schools could be opened safely, and ensuring that both the safety of learners as well as educators was paramount. And all of those have been provided to government. And as I've said from the beginning of this crisis, we've been very solutions-oriented. Every single week, we've been submitting suggestions to government, including last week's plan about how they could get through this next wave of infection and get as many South Africans safely to the other side. And that was released last week. It's quite interesting that you talk about the government court victories recently, because at my last count, there have been 3 cases where government was taken to court to close schools, and government has won every single one of those cases, because the scientific evidence, because the rational approach shows very clearly that there is no reason based in law or rationality to close the schools. And that's why government has prevailed in all 3 of those cases, which makes their decision to bend the knee to the unions in this particular instance, and to ignore the pleas from parents, from students, from school governing bodies, from education experts, and from medical experts, to ignore those completely and to make this particular irrational decision. Great. I think is that it? Has everybody got to put a question? Nobody else want to keep the practice in? I know you don't get to ask the president questions, so if anyone wants to keep their practice in, please feel free to ask away.
I'm saying you're the president. Kidding.
No, if I was the president, I wouldn't be taking questions. Great. Well, thanks very much, everybody. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining, and thanks for your time. And thank you, Belinda and Nomsa. Go well, keep safe, and we'll see you again soon.